Well, this is kind of awkward. I curse my phrasing sometimes. I remember what we said last video about how we thought that It Ain't Easy Being Breezy's practically wrote itself, that apart from some minor hiccups that seemed completely understandable in the context of the script, it was flawless to us. Well, fast forward a week to this episode, and a completely different feeling overtook me halfway through, to the point where I had to remind myself that I need to watch this again in order to write a decent analysis. I was disappointed at how much I could have enjoyed this episode, but a significant amount of things prevented me from doing so. We'll go into depth when we get to them.
Somepony to Watch Over Me is an episode by Scott Sunborn, one of the new writers that was brought on for Season 4. He's mainly known for his Beavis and Butthead and Celebrity Deathmatch writing. Considering neither of us have seen any of the shows he's written for, we were pretty much in the dark for what to expect. Vicodin admittedly had extremely high hopes of this episode, considering it was a nod towards the Kumar Crusaders coming-of-age narrative, which had also been referenced in Twilight Time, and it dealt with a family event that nearly everyone above the target demographic could empathize with. Maybe it's just us, but Vicodin and I both remember the first time we were allowed to stay home.
Nevertheless, let's begin. The beginning of the episode is excellent, and I wouldn't change a single word of it. The entire opener scene identified with me, and I'm sure a lot of other people back when you were a teenager and you put on a persona of calmness only to rip it off the moment the Guardians leave. Or in Applebloom's case, use the old trope of being calm for a few moments until the excited explosion. Alex and I don't really have that much to say about this, other than the fact that Applebloom obviously prepared her calmness towards the Apple family's decision beforehand due to her hoof wave towards her friends. Excellent opener. Also, Sweetie Belle is squeaky as usual.
Within Act 1, Granny Smith, Applejack, and Big Mac prepare for their delivery while Applebloom, in her excitement, almost drops 3 pies. Applejack thankfully saves the pies and lectures Applebloom on the importance of the chores that were left for her. Applebloom reminds Applejack, probably because of the commercial break, that she's got the chores handled and is happy that she's old enough to be trusted. Applejack accidentally hurts Applebloom's feelings by implying that the only reason that Applejack was letting Applebloom stay behind was because the farm was safer. Considering the numerous amount of creatures that are just in the Everfree Forest, we can pretty much take Applejack's word for it that where she's going is not meant for Applebloom.
Applejack consoles Applebloom with her reasoning that she is serious about being a big sister, which has definitely been conveyed in canon over and over. We know that family is probably the most important thing to the apples, but the problem that begins to show, at least for us, is the list that Applejack gives Applebloom.
There's some soup for you in the refrigerator. Be sure not to heat it up too much. If it's hot, blow on it to cool it off. And take little sips. If you gulp, you could get hiccups.
This was the first moment where Alex and I sort of began to grow awkward about the episode. The entire suggestion off the list that Applebloom reads out conveys the idea that Applejack really doesn't trust her with the house. If we take Magical Mystery Cure into account, we can assume that there are a significant amount of chores on Sweet Apple Acres, so the list would be long. The problem, though, is that this, along with the soup suggestion, makes me hesitate because these suggestions basically conveyed the sisters' relationship as something that's not exactly the case.
Both Applejack and Applebloom have probably one of the healthiest sibling relationships as far as the cast is concerned, and that's even counting Twilight and Spike. Throughout the show, we've seen AJ and AB turn the chores into a game in Sisterhood Social, which I'd imagine after doing for supposedly longer than a year, if the time frame given in the Season 4 opener is to be accepted, would possibly strengthen their bond and trust to a point higher than what this list portrays. The both of them competed in Sisterhood Social and were strong enough in their bond to avoid any sort of jealousy on Applebloom's part when Sweetie Belle borrowed AJ. Not to mention the fact that Applebloom completely proved the whole cast wrong about Zecora in Bridal Gossip. While Applebloom has also had her run-ins with problems throughout nearly every CMC episode, that doesn't really lower her on the maturity scale as much as it heightens her for having life experience and for supposedly growing because of those experiences.
But all of that is kind of rendered moot by this letter. The letter implies that Applebloom is way lower than Applejack in maturity, which I believe is in some ways true. Applebloom is way too dangerous with the pies, for example, and risks her life later on down the line when she leaves the house to deliver the pies, which isn't something I'd say is mature, but we'll discuss that later. The point we're trying to get at is that this whole list was awkward, and while we can write it off as Applejack bringing out the adorable side within her when it came to her sister, maybe it's just headcanon, but I'd like to think that their relationship is better than this. And even if it wasn't, if the list was populated with more items such as this, that's more insulting than coddling in my opinion.
Moving on, Applebloom gives Applejack the inevitable question of whether or not she's actually being trusted. While Big Mac and Granny Smith put on smiles that could only fool Philly, which is again debatable since Applebloom is pretty smart, Applejack agrees and Applebloom pushes her off in excitement. Meanwhile, during their trek, Applejack begins to worry and second guesses her choice. Now, we can both agree that Applejack's worries are completely understandable. Much like any parent leaving their child home, there's always the pit of dread that lurks within your stomach, the thought that you'll come home to World War III reenacted in your house. But then we get this line.
I didn't write down that if she wants to get a spoon out of the drawer, she needs to open the drawer first.
Can we agree that this line was poorly conveyed at the least? We don't want to dwell on it since this kind of becomes rampant throughout the episode, but I'm definitely sure that in order to get a spoon out of the drawer, you need to open the drawer. I mean, one of our friends pointed out that this is obviously a gag to paint Applejack as unreasonable with a hyperbolic line, as in, haha, she's really worried to the point where her line is making no sense. That's fine, that's cool, that's practically the pinnacle of Pinkie Pie's character when placed under certain writers. This was also a few line choices of less than zero to a point, and it worked because Twilight's lines clicked with her character. Another example is the classic "throw me in a dungeon in the place that she banished me" line from Bird and a Hoof. Hyperbolic lines aren't bad, they can be a very funny way to portray a character either missing the point or breaking down mentally, for comedic or dramatic effect. But the problem is that this is a conveyance choice being used on Applejack, who is arguably the most headstrong of the main six. Now, that's not to say that Applejack is completely barred from stupid hyperbolic lines, that was like half of Applebuck's season as well. The problem is that given all of the characterization that Applejack was given in her episodes before this one, the entire episode feels out of place. It feels like something that belongs in Season 1, back when Rainbow Dash kind of didn't like Fluttershy because she was a doormat as conveyed in Dragonshy. But since we're so ahead in the series, Applejack just feels like she's acting in a way that she never would, but we have to go with it because it's an episode.
Applejack's hesitation to go back and check up on Applebloom was something that we could get behind. No problem, we'll just throw the awkward line behind us and forget that existed. Meanwhile, Applebloom finishes up the chores and enjoys the freedom of her labor for maybe 15 seconds, along with a self-aware comment on monologuing to oneself for no reason, before Applejack bursts in. Applebloom falls off the table and creates a huge mess while Applejack comes in and begins to lecture her. For the most part, we can agree with Applejack insofar as the house can be dangerous. After all, that refrigerator is at least 4 times the size of Applebloom, so if it were to fall on her like it almost did later, that would indeed be a serious injury.
Also, we have to take in context the first thing that Applejack saw. Applebloom was standing on one hind leg and more or less messing around on a surface that is meant for eating. Then she falls and makes a huge mess. Combining this with Applejack's previous worries, the scene that plays out is not awkward in the slightest, even with the reminder that Applebloom is a little more mature than Applejack gives her credit for in this episode. And when it comes to Applebloom's comment on her failing was Applejack's fault, I feel like I'm getting old at 20. If you aren't messing around on the table, you wouldn't have fallen over. It doesn't really matter that AJ came crashing through the front door.
Also, Applejack's comment on how she should have never left Applebloom alone was kind of harsh. With the condescending list and the entire reason that Applebloom was left alone, this just sort of widens the gap between the two of them, one that we feel wouldn't actually exist if this wasn't an episode. But then again, that brings up the whole conversation of whether or not these two actually fight in their world when it's not an episode. And I can't really say that's the case if canon settles every problem of theirs in ways that would only strengthen their relationship.
Applebloom fails to get some soup by trying to grab it out of the fridge and ends up spilling it all over herself. Admittedly, she should have used a chair because then she would have been able to lift it onto the chair and then onto the floor, but she was too focused on proving Applejack wrong immediately that she didn't think about it. I'm beginning to see a trend in the conveyance choices of this episode. They're all backwards. We're supposed to feel sorry for Applebloom at the end of Act 1, even though it was her fault that she basically proved Applejack right with her lack of patience and thinking.
But the problem with that is that Applejack shouldn't be right. Pretty much every CMC episode past Season 1 and the previous relationships Applebloom has with the cast, especially the theme of her growing up a little in Twilight Time, pretty much shows that Applebloom is smarter and more mature than this episode gives her credit for. And it's because of this that we were taken out of the episode. When Act 2 comes around, I couldn't stop myself asking why Applejack was being written this way, while Vicodin had to sink down into his fan mindset to keep himself going, which is the complete opposite of what we did with Breezes and even Bats.
Act 2 comes around and the "I can take care of things myself" line is beginning to seem redundant. Applebloom tries to rake up the leaves, but Applejack basically made it unusable with a pillow. And then we get the helmet gag, which admittedly made me laugh nearly every time it was put on Applebloom, but as I previously said, the caveat was that we kind of threw our headcanon, and pretty much the established canon of the Applebloom and Applejack relationship, out the window. Applebloom tries to prove herself, but everything is already practically baby-proof. Also, just a small thing, but I think putting training wheels on that wheelbarrow was not really a coddling or annoying big sister action. Sure, it's remotely insulting, just like with the list, but it also opens up the wheelbarrow to be used by other ponies.
We get I can take care of myself again, along with Applejack's increasingly more insulting stance on how she doesn't want to hurt her little sister. And let's just fast forward to the CMCs. They're being adorable as usual, and Applebloom figures out her plan to deliver the pies herself in order to prove her maturity. And, oh my god, Sweetie Belle and Scootaloo with a bow. You know what? Freaking all the CMCs with bows. 10 out of 10, best episode ever. Anyway, Scootaloo suggests that the remaining CMCs pretend to be Applebloom sleeping, and it works, somehow. Despite Sweetie Belle having a different coat, main style, and that's all being illuminated by the nearby window. The simple fact is that Applejack really shouldn't have been tricked by this plan. Even the watermelon with a wig thing that's done in other cartoons is more believable than this.
The Almost song made me laugh pretty hard, considering that was 2 for 0 on self-aware humor that actually worked with me, and I'm happy for that. Applebloom leaves to go deliver the cart, and Applejack is tricked for now. We get a funny scene of her checking up on Applebell every few seconds until Applejack finally figures it out. Applejack panics and rushes around the room upon finding that Applebloom pretty much only went on the journey with the map and the cart. Oh, also, Applejack's face and close-up shot at the end of Act 2 was adorable.
Coming into Act 3, we get a little funny scene of Applejack listing the things that Applebloom failed to bring. Sweetie Belle says that Applebloom left hours ago, and Applejack worries once more before we cut to Applebloom. Now, this was another part of the scene where we wouldn't really change much, even if it was built on a premise conveyance that we can't really agree with. The Chimera was an awesome monster, and the entirety of this scene certainly picks up the episode from just being awkward to us. Skip a little bit and Applebloom manages to hold her own against the monster, and was even willing to sacrifice her livelihood to rescue the pies, when again, it's debatable whether or not the mature thing to do would just be to cut your losses and save your skin.
We get the metaphor from the Chimera that sort of links to Applebloom's predicament. The entire you don't know what it feels like to have a sister constantly looking over your shoulder line just gives me that awkward feeling once again, even in the mentality of a fan. I mean, I'm glad that the writer was able to inject this sister coddling metaphor, but when it feels as out of place as this, you wonder if it would have been better without it. And then that just becomes a slippery slope to questioning the reasoning of the Chimera, the pie delivery for the third act, and so on.
Applejack saves Applebloom with some awesome and obviously practiced moves. Applejack has definitely faced this thing before, even if the Chimera doesn't hint at it, or at least Applejack was given prior information on it. The Chimera is outsmarted, and the sisters have a little one-to-one about how far Applebloom brought the cart by herself, despite how dangerous it was. They bring the cart the rest of the way, and Applejack decides on not babying Applebloom anymore. End of episode.
So yeah, there was a significant amount to like within this episode, such as the comedic back and forths between the CMCs and AJ, and the helmet gag and the self-awareness jokes, but I feel like this is going to be one of the episodes that I'm not really going to watch again. Honestly, there's nothing that I could really take from this episode without some sort of caveat. The entire plot of the episode just doesn't work for me, and it's based on a contrived narrative. What if AJ didn't find out that Sweetie Belle was Applebloom? Applebloom would be dead. What if AJ trusted Applebloom as much as she does if this was a regular day in the MLP world? There would be no episode.
The comedy was funny, but destroyed or ignored the characterization that every other writer would know by watching one Applejack episode. It was less Applejack and more of a character in Applejack's situation with confusing conveyance choices over who we were supposed to root for that ended up making Viking and I root for neither of them. I had to treat this episode in the same vein as Spike at Your Service, which was essentially brain off and enjoy the Technicolor horses, and I know for a fact that this show is better than that. Compared to Levenger's first episode, Scott really hasn't put on a good first impression, and that's not a good sign when the only other first impressions that were really bad were Chris Savino, writer of Ghostbusters and Stairmaster, and debatably Josh Haber of Castlevania.
I've heard some people say that this was a good episode, and that they were able to completely sympathize with Applebloom's problem. Combined with the awesome Chimera creature and the interesting town that the sisters delivered the pies to, there's a lot in this episode to take from it. Yes, I can agree with that. But as we previously said, the plot was completely contrived and unrealistic, reliant on frequent passes of the idiot ball, which in writer terms is basically characters fueling the plotline with their stupidity. The list, the table, Scootaloo's blabbermouth, Applejack's completely unrealistic and perfect timing to take down the Chimera, combined with a lesson that we feel was terribly portrayed. The entire Act 3 of Applebloom making a point to Applejack by taking the cart into the dangerous swamp is not really a way to show maturity, and Applejack going along with it just makes it worse for us.
Let's provide an example, one that's kind of personal for one of us, but we shall not name who. In the state court system, when it comes to divorces and the custody arrangements between two parents, the child's opinion varies from state to state. In this particular state, for example, children had no say what the custody was, but after a certain age were able to provide input on the environment that both parents were providing for them. We must also keep in mind that courts had to be cautious with this information, considering children could easily be bribed to badmouth the other parent. Now, if a child runs away from one of their mom's or dad's home, their input on the custody court system has a large chance of being revoked. Why is this?
The reason doesn't even completely apply to the old folk wisdom of never run away from your problems, although it certainly has something to do with it. The reason is because running away is a serious thing to do. Even if you only go down a few blocks and just refuse to go home, it's handled under the same point of view under the court system as if you've moved states to run away from your parents. Sure, there is something to be said for the fact that it's kind of sensationalistic to equate leaving states with leaving in general, but there is a problem with running away in general. It's an example of naivety for the child to run away from a place that's mostly controlled, if we hold all things equal in the household such as no child abuse or anything, to a world that's completely random.
This problem was amplified with the fact that, unlike Seabreeze running away and It Ain't Easy being breezes, Applebloom knows that things like the Everfree Forest exist. So regularly, Applebloom would know that Equestria is a very dangerous place. But because of this episode, she doesn't, and she embarks on a quest that I can only see as appealing to the childhood fantasy and overly done cartoon choice of a character proving themselves by doing something massively out of their league, but they only manage to do it due to, again, the idiot ball, and in Applebloom's case, plot armor.
Well, that just about covers this episode of In Retrospect. Make sure to subscribe if you already haven't, give us a thumbs up, and leave any comments or questions if you wish for our soon-to-come after-analysis video. Sorry for being too harsh on this episode. I know there are going to be some people that say that our attack on this episode was spurred from the high standards that we referenced to in the beginning of the video, and I can't really deny that. This episode could have been amazing, and the opener was amazing, but Acts 1 through 3 just completely fell apart. Like a parent would say, I'm not really angry with this episode, I'm just disappointed.